Hello and welcome to the fourth part of a lecture on the scientific methods. In this part of the lecture, we will discuss human interference because up until now, we have always discussed that the scientific method is some philosophical concept that describes the ideal way that scientists do science, that scientists gather new knowledge. And this ideal way assumes that we just look at previous data to create a hypothesis, that we are very unbiased and not leading towards a certain outcome of the result and just construct our experiments and then look at the actual data and do our work in a very um, robotic way. But the reality is that science, just like any form of human interaction, is a human endeavor and it's done by humans. So humans are always going to insert an influence on that. And we discussed this briefly in the part on experimental biases can lead to bias, but it doesn't necessarily have to lead to bias. There's forms of human interference that exert an influence on the way that scientists do research that don't necessarily always result in a bad outcome. Now, if you look at scientists or the people involved in doing science, it's obviously the scientists themselves, and this varies from a PhD or a student that does a study in the lab to postdocs that coordinate those studies or professors that are mainly writing projects to get the money in and then delegate these tasks to other researchers. And each of these individuals can obviously have an outcome on how the research is done, on what type of research is done, and how we gather new knowledge and where do we go in the future. Now, on top of that, there's things that are becoming more and more important. There are funding agencies because, like we said before, science is becoming a profession. So you need money to hire people to do the science. So this gives funding agencies the power to steer what type of science is done, what type of research is done, and what potential outcomes might be. And then on top of these funding agencies are often funded by either governments, taxpayers, or private institutions, and they also have an influence on what we do, which experiments we do, what type of research, which research domains are more important. So this is how science nowadays works. Now, if you look at science and both in academia and companies, and mainly in academia, of course, because companies fund research internally themselves, we see that in academia, which should be very objective and should be only knowledge driven, we see that the scientific method actually is more and more containing a step that specifically um, focus on economics. We have to seek funding. This can be through funding agencies that fund a project for you. This can be via patents or creating spin-offs that then create revenue that you can use to do new research to make it more like a company feel. And in companies, obviously, your research should lead to better products, that should lead to more revenue, that should lead to more research. So, seeking funding, both in academia and in the industry, is the reality that science should adhere to. It's the economic reality of the society that we live in today. Now, this obviously influences the way we do research. If you look at academic research, we're very much dependent on project funded research. So we write a project and we ask, for instance, in the Netherlands, NWO, the Nederlandse Organisatie voor Wetenschappelijk Onderzoek, which funds all types of natural science research in the Netherlands, or we can go to the European Union and apply for a project in Horizon 2020 where you collaborate with multiple academic partners and a couple of selected industrial partners on a large uh, transnational project, or you can do an indirect project, which is a little bit more applied. It's usually a public-private um, collaboration between universities and smaller and medium enterprises in your region, and you try to have a cross-border collaboration in certain what they call EU-regions, so inter-regional, meaning that you have, for instance, the border region between Belgium and the Netherlands where you can find different partners. And we as a research group are very much involved in this Interreg scheme, which is also logical because Maastricht is located at the cross-border region between Germany and Belgium, which gives us the opportunity to do cross-border collaboration. And that is a way that researchers need to position themselves and need to exploit or use uh, the the type of research and its impact, but also the geographical location of the institute where you do the research at, and you can use that to get more funding. But this obviously also influences the way that we do science because these certain projects have certain goals, so certain themes you should adhere to. Obviously, now a lot of money is going to COVID, so by governments, both European Union or the national governments, funding research towards COVID, they actually determine what type of research is done. So this is how society, governments, and funding agencies determine what type of research is done, and that is not always bad. That doesn't mean that the outcome is necessarily biased, but it does mean that a specific societal need that needs to be addressed is not always addressed because the scientists feel that it needs addressing. So that's how science nowadays works. And on one hand, philosophically, that's not good. But on the other hand, as science should also serve society and scientists are paid by taxpayers, it's only logical that these governments representing the people also have a little say in what type of research is done and also evaluate how the research is going. On top of projects, you can also fund specific research. So when we feel like, okay, this is a brilliant researcher, you can apply for a Marie Curie scholarship and go to another university abroad. And if you're really good, you can go for a Vini, Vidi, or Vicky scholarship from the NWO or an ERC scholarship from the European Research Council. And this is a little bit more open. There, it's more the researcher that decides what type of research is done. And the European Union doesn't have a team, or NW doesn't have a team, and Marie Curie neither. These scholarships don't have a certain team. Obviously, there's the bigger strategic uh, development plan for the European Union and for a country, but this is a little bit more open. Here, the researcher actually determines I'm gonna do this, and I think it has an impact on society in this and this and this way. And then they judge, okay, this guy or this person is very capable, and the idea is really good. Just let him. Here is money. Just let him or her or they uh, do the research and come up with new results that might influence the development of society in a very positive manner. So there, the influence of the government is less pronounced than in project-funded research. Now, on top of that, sometimes the government takes it one step further and gathers researchers and puts them in a certain dedicated project. For instance, the Manhattan Project, which was really famous for developing the nuclear bomb. But there's also the Brain Initiative, focused on neurosciences, and the Human Genome Project, which led to biologists and biochemics studying the human genome and unraveling the human genome. And this knowledge was used to further advance science in different fields. On top of that, what we always see is that whenever the societal burden of a certain disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, becomes too high, we see that governments and non-governmental organizations too often make research funds that are aimed at solving a specific disease. And also, again, this influences the way we do science and what type of science we do. In addition to government and the government and non-governmental organizations funding research. There's also private research funding. When we think about private research funding, we often think about companies doing research on their own, right? We think about companies developing certain project, a pharmaceutical company developing companies putting money into the development of vaccines, for instance, for their own benefit. But what also happens is that companies have research funds aimed at doing research that is not solely belong to the company. For instance, AXA Bank, but also IBM has a joint venture with MIT, and there's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. These are private investors that invest in research without having the promise of getting patents out of it, getting revenue out of it, just do it for philanthropist reasons. So this also happens, but in a way they also shape the way we do science and what type of science we do. Now, like I said, this is also not always leading to bias because I think that human interference, even if you look at the detailed version of the scientific, always plays a role. Because when we gather data from an experiment and we do the data processing, sometimes it's very clear what the correlation between an independent and a dependent variable is, but sometimes it isn't. So it can be like two people having a similar scientific background looking at the same data and coming up with a different interpretation. And in your results and discussion section that you write in either a paper or a lab report, you will discuss what you think that the data means. And other scientists, when you do peer review, might disagree with that. And you might come to some kind of agreement where you say, I interpret the data in this and this way because of this and this reason. And you will reason with each other and come to some mutual ground where eventually you come to an explanation for the data you gathered and what that means for the hypotheses and maybe also the overlying theory. And this actually helps you get further. So this human interference can actually have a very positive influence on science. Moreover, I think that human interference is actually essential to the scientific method because the scientific method contains a lot of reasoning. It contains deduction, so you go from a very general fact to a specific fact, and the conclusion at each step of your reasoning process should flow from your premise with certainty. So the conclusion you take from certain data and what to conclude from that can only be the right, can only be one conclusion from the data. For instance, only flowering plants have flowers. Let's say that's something that we established. And grass has flowers. From these two premises, you can only draw one conclusion, right? All flowering plants have flowers. Grass have flowers. So grass is a flowering plant. This is deduction. Deduction is also very important in science where you go from a very specific observation to a more general observation. And then you're not working with certainty. So it can be that you, for instance, observe many, many different life forms, and all these different life forms contain DNA. For instance, we know that the COVID virus only has RNA, but in certain definitions of life, a virus is not life form. It's not a life form. So the conclusion can be all life contains DNA, but it's not impossible that one day we'll find a life form that adheres to all definitions of living beings and still contains only RNA. So that is possible. But until that point, you can reason that all life must contain DNA. And that's what I mean. Like this process of deduction and induction is very important in the way we do science. And that's also how humans interfere with the process of science. And that's how science, although philosophically speaking, always has to be objective, and the experiments always lead to results that are only interpretable in one way, in reality, that's often not the case. How to overcome that leads into bias or into pseudoscience? Well, Karl Popper was a famous philosopher that introduced the process of falsification. And this falsification process is actually a process that scientists implement in the way they construct their experiments and the way they design their hypotheses to prevent interference from hindering skepticism, to prevent interference from actually turning into bias and bad science. And the concept of falsification actually means that a good hypothesis should be falsifiable. This means that it should be open to being rejected. So you design a hypothesis in such a way that you know that, okay, if I find this and this evidence, I have to conclude that my hypothesis was false. So this ensures that you're always very skeptical. If you look at pseudoscience or non-scientific endeavors, you don't have that, right? For instance, non-scientific endeavors such as religion, you're not looking at your hypotheses as God exists, but you're not looking at experiments to falsify the fact that God exists because it burns down or it is all based on faith. So in non-science, you don't have that skepticism. Also, in pseudoscience, that is endeavors that look like science and claim to be scientific, but are not scientific, you'll see this same problem. For instance, in homeopathy, um, they dilute a certain substance infinitely and then claim it still works. However, you would say like, okay, if we are going to watch or we're going to analyze your medicine and we notice that the active substance is no longer there due to heavy diluting, you should falsify the fact that this works because there's nothing in there because the way you say it works, it can't work. And what pseudoscience like homeopathy does then is come up with an ad hoc hypothesis to defend that faulty hypotheses in the first place by saying, yeah, but by shaking it against a certain membrane, we create a memory in the water, and although the active component is no longer there, the water will remember that the active component was there and it will still work. Obviously, when you think about it, that's nonsense, obviously, because that would mean that the water would like remember anything it ever came in contact with. So that is the difference between pseudoscience and non-science. That's how interference can steer science and determine the way we do science, but doesn't necessarily always lead to outcomes that are biased. And by staying skeptical, by having falsification in the way we do our hypotheses, the way we look at our data, we try to prevent bias from sneaking in, although there's many instances where scientists also have known to be biased and committed fraud just for the sake of their career or the sake of their own beliefs and ambitions. Thank you for your attention.